religion to obscure the fact and take it over, and there isn't a great deal of time. In fact, A.N. Sherman White, who is an Oxford scholar of ancient Greek and Roman history, he has argued in one of his books, now it's important to recognize he was not talking specifically about the resurrection when he said this, but he has made the point that the span of 2 full generations would not be sufficient time for myth and legend to accrue and distort historical fact. So this demythologizing idea, the idea that myth and legend has distorted and has overtaken the factual data of the New Testament, that's going to take a little bit of time.
Yeah.
And the time span we're talking about for Paul's epistles, for the oral presentation of the apostles' preaching, remember, the apostles are preaching and teaching before they're writing all of this stuff down.
Yeah.
Legend expert Julius Muller has even stated that legend cannot replace fact as long as the eyewitnesses are still alive.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
So,
and there would have been plenty of people around to say, hey, wait a second, we were there, that didn't happen.
That's
so
right.
It's not just friendly people again. You had plenty of hostile witnesses.
I mean, if the disciples would have invented out of whole cloth, people would have said, wait a second, I was there. I saw these things. We could add to that, the gospel writings don't correspond to what we recognize as myth and legendary writings. The disciples even say, we recognize the difference between myth and eyewitness testimony. Peter even says that. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. We didn't invent cleverly devised tales. And the Greek word, mythos. So I think there is very good reasons for believing that a mythological or legendary explanation does not have solid footing. It would have taken much longer for that to happen. The disciples recognized the differences. The New Testament doesn't correspond to other mythological writings, and so there's very good reasons for doubting that as a good explanation when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus.
Okay, how about a second naturalistic explanation for the resurrection?
Okay, the hypothesis number 2 would be something along these lines. The disciples could have stolen the body and created a hoax. Maybe the apostles just came along and they took the body. In fact, this is, of course, what the Roman guards said. They came up with a way of kind of dodge responsibility, and they said, well, let's say the disciples came in and stole the body and got away with it so that we won't be blamed for what happened here. This is kind of the first naturalistic explanatory hypothesis, if you will.
So they would have had to move the stone and somehow go undetected by the Roman guard.
And that, of course, then begins raising, I think, some careful questions about the consistency of this view, the plausibility of this view, whether it fits the facts. I mean, what possible motivation would the apostles have for stealing the body? The apostles seemingly had nothing to gain and everything to lose. They would suffer hardship, persecution, martyrdom. Remember, these are first century Jews, even damnation for inventing a divine Christ. It seems that they have virtually nothing to gain and everything to lose from creating a hoax.
Yeah.
Another criticism, if the apostles stole the body and then created a hoax concerning the resurrection appearances, would they have been willing to die as martyrs for what they knew was false? I mean, people do die for things they believe. The Heaven's Gate group down here in San Diego, California, they committed suicide believing that there was a UFO behind the Hale-Bopp comet.
Right.
But they believed it to be true. The apostles, if they stole the body and invented the resurrection story, if it's a big fish story, then they died for what they knew was a lie. I don't think they were that dumb.
That's pretty tough, yeah.
A third criticism, the apostles do not come across as charlatans and myth makers, Joe. Candidly, they seem simple, honest, truth-telling folk. They don't seem sometimes even sophisticated to be able to pull that kind of thing off. wouldn't it have cracked? Wouldn't this conspiracy theory come apart? I mean, they were put under a lot of pressure. They suffered hardship, persecution.
Yeah.
Another point, how does this hypothesis in any way explain the dramatic change in the apostles themselves?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what transformed them from being defeated cowards before the crucifixion and then become preachers and martyrs in the book of Acts and willing to stand up to all of these kinds of things? It seems to me when we begin to evaluate both of these theories, Joe, both of these hypotheses, myth and legend, or the disciples stole the body, they seem very implausible. They seem to lack explanatory power and scope. They don't explain the transformation of the apostles. They lack kind of credibility in terms of kind of holding together. Again, conspiracies are hard to hold together when you have everything to lose and nothing to gain. And so I think based upon the criteria we've set forth, both of these naturalistic theories are inadequate.
Yeah, yeah. Could you also say, Ken, that if indeed they had a body and they took it somewhere, that in subsequent generations that would become some kind of worship site or holy site of some kind, or we'd find something, we'd learn something more about that particular site.
Yeah, and it will point out in a later point, Joe, I mean, the Romans and the Jews had a lot of people and resources. Why couldn't they go out there and sort through all of this and get to the facts? But they were never able to come to anything other than the tomb is empty.
He's gone, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. That covers a couple of naturalistic explanations. You've got several more in the upcoming podcast, right?
Yes.
You want to tease for the next podcast?
Yeah, we're going to look at some other issues. We'll talk about, for example, is it possible that the women went to the wrong tomb? I mean, they just made a wrong turn.
Yeah.
They didn't have a GPS to
That's right.
show them where to go. Is it possible as well that maybe Jesus wasn't dead? Maybe he swooned and was able to convince his disciples that he had died, but really he remained alive.
I'd like to hear about that one. We'll hear that next time. Ken, thank you for your comments. We want to point out that you've written about this in a chapter in your book, Without a Doubt, and maybe you can direct us to another resource or two on the resurrection.
Very important that Christians are able to recognize some really good books. Here is a book written by a distinguished Christian philosopher, Richard Swinburne, a British Christian and philosopher. He wrote the book, The Resurrection of God Incarnate. The Resurrection of God Incarnate. He looks at many philosophical issues. He looks at probability issues and history. This is a very important book defending the historical resurrection of Christ.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, Ken, again, I thank you for your comments. Hopefully listeners are really learning that there's good reason to believe in the resurrection, and we will continue with that in the upcoming podcast. Gary, your host, along with theologian and philosopher Kenneth Samples. Hello, Ken.
Hi.
Ken, you've been talking about the resurrection now for a good, I think we've done 5 podcasts thus far. And you got 3 more to do in this series. On the last time, you introduced other alternative explanations, especially those that naturalists would bring to the table. So you talked about 2 of those, and you got a couple of more today, right?
That's exactly right. I want to explore 2 more naturalistic hypotheses in terms of explaining the data for the resurrection. Again, we'll bring back up this concept of abductive reasoning. And then in the next podcast, we'll knock off a couple more